On a Saturday morning in January 2025, China issued something it rarely does. A second statement within hours. The target was not a rival power or a regional dispute. It was the United States, and the subject was Venezuela. Beijing accused Washington of hegemonic acts and the blatant use of force. The reason: President Donald Trump had announced that the United States had taken Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro and his wife, flown them out of the country, and effectively toppled a government in the Western Hemisphere. This was not a covert operation leaked years later. It was announced publicly, carried out openly, and framed by Washington as decisive action. For China, it was something else entirely. A signal that the United States was willing to use force in ways that Beijing could not counter, and in a region where Chinese economic interests have been growing for over a decade. The extraction of Maduro did more than remove a controversial leader. It exposed a strategic imbalance that China has been trying to manage quietly for years. Beijing buys Venezuelan oil. It has invested billions across Latin America. It has built trade partnerships and infrastructure projects from Argentina to the Caribbean. And now, in a matter of hours, the United States had demonstrated that none of that could protect a government from physical removal. If Washington decided it was necessary, China's response was immediate and sharp. It demanded the release of Maduro. It called for respect of the United Nations Charter. It condemned what it described as violations of sovereignty. But behind the language was a reality that Beijing could not ignore. China was watching a test case for how far the United States might go to reassert control in regions where Chinese influence had been expanding. Andy Moak, a senior research fellow at the Center for China and Globalization, noted that a Chinese delegation had been meeting with Venezuelan officials just hours before the U.S. action. Beijing was not caught off guard. It had been monitoring U.S. strategic and economic interests in Venezuela for years. What stood out, Moak said, was not that the operation happened, but how it was carried out. The method, he suggested, may represent the long-term U.S. strategy in the region: direct, unilateral, and irreversible. For China, the timing was especially sensitive. Venezuela supplies roughly 4 to 5% of China's total oil imports, making it a significant but not critical source. But the extraction of Maduro was not just about oil, it was about precedent. If the United States could physically remove a head of state in Latin America without facing meaningful consequences, then other governments in the region, governments that had grown closer to Beijing, might reconsider their alignments. And that shift would not be driven by diplomacy or economic incentives. It would be driven by fear. Sean Rain, founder of the China Market Research Group, told Al Jazeera that Beijing is deeply alarmed but constrained. China has issued strong condemnations. It has coordinated with other Latin American and Caribbean nations to call the action illegal. But beyond rhetoric, Rayan said China's options are limited. There is not a lot of things that China can do, frankly. It doesn't have the military power. It only has 2 military bases outside of China, while America has 800. He added that historically, China is not warlike. It does not project force in the way the United States does. And in this case, it cannot. China will not respond with military action. It will not impose economic sanctions that would risk damaging its own trade relationships with the United States. What it can do is watch, condemn, and calculate. And that calculation is already underway, because the Maduro extraction is not an isolated event. It is part of a broader contest over influence in the global South, where China has been expanding its economic footprint for years, while the United States has been perceived as retreating. Venezuela had become a symbol of that shift, a country where Chinese loans, oil purchases, and investment had replaced American engagement. And now, in a single operation, the United States had demonstrated that economic influence does not protect a government from physical removal. From Beijing's perspective, this was not just about Venezuela. It was about Taiwan. It was about the South China Sea. It was about every region where China has been building leverage through infrastructure, trade, and loans. If the United States was willing to extract a head of state in Latin America, what would it do in the Indo-Pacific? What would it do if a government in Southeast Asia became too aligned with Beijing? What would it do if tensions over Taiwan escalated beyond diplomacy? These are not hypothetical questions for Chinese strategists. They are immediate concerns that shape how Beijing views American intentions, and the extraction of Maduro has answered some of those questions in ways that China did not want confirmed. China's response has been coordinated with Latin American allies. It has condemned the operation at the United Nations. It has framed the action as a violation of international law and a dangerous precedent. But coordination is not deterrence. Condemnation is not defense, and Beijing knows that. What makes this moment more dangerous is that China has no clear escalation path in the South China Sea. It can send ships. In Taiwan, it can conduct military drills in Africa. It can expand port access and infrastructure. But in Latin America, China does not have the military presence to counter U.S. operations. It does not have the alliance network to impose costs, and it does not have the ability to protect governments that have aligned with Beijing. If Washington decides they are a threat to U.S. interests. Ryan noted that China is just going to make proclamations criticizing the United States' actions, but it is not going to push back with military action or economic sanctions. That restraint is not a choice. It is a recognition of limits, and those limits are now visible to governments across Latin America, Africa, and Asia. For years, China has presented an alternative model to the United States: economic partnership without military demands, infrastructure investment without political interference, trade without regime change. The extraction of Maduro challenges that narrative. It suggests that no matter how much Chinese money flows into a country, the United States can still remove a government if it decides to do so, and China cannot stop it. That realization is shaping Beijing's strategy in real time. If Chinese economic influence cannot protect aligned governments, then China must either accept that limitation or find ways to increase its ability to project power. The first option means retreat. The second means confrontation, and neither is sustainable without risk. Up to this point, China's approach in Latin America had been incremental: loans for infrastructure, oil purchases, trade deals. But now, that approach is being tested in ways Beijing did not anticipate. The United States has shown that it is willing to act unilaterally, regardless of Chinese objections. And that willingness is forcing China to make decisions it has been avoiding for years. The extraction of Maduro is not the end of a crisis. It is the beginning of a recalibration. Beijing is now reassessing its investments in Latin America. It is evaluating which governments it can protect, which it cannot, and what kind of escalation it is willing to accept if Washington decides to act again. These are not abstract policy questions. They are immediate strategic dilemmas that will shape China's behavior in every region where it competes with the United States. From Kiev's perspective, this matters because it changes the calculation of how far major powers are willing to go to defend their interests. If the United States can extract a head of state in Latin America without facing meaningful consequences, then Ukraine is watching closely to see whether that same willingness extends to Europe. And if China is constrained in how it responds to U.S. actions in Venezuela, then Moscow is calculating whether Beijing will be equally constrained if the war in Ukraine escalates further. The connections between these theaters are not coincidental. They are structural. Every action the United States takes to reassert influence in one region sends signals to rivals and allies in others. And every constraint that China faces in Latin America becomes a data point for how Beijing might respond to pressure elsewhere. What Beijing cannot do is ignore what happened in Venezuela. The extraction of Maduro was not a covert operation that could be denied or downplayed. It was announced by the President of the United States. It was framed as decisive leadership, and it was carried out in a way that left no room for negotiation or reversal for China. That clarity is more dangerous than ambiguity. It means the United States is no longer testing the boundaries of what Beijing will tolerate. It is defining those boundaries unilaterally, and China is being forced to respond not with strength, but with condemnation. The next phase of this contest will not be measured in statements or diplomatic coordination. It will be measured in decisions by China about where it will increase military presence, decisions by the United States about which governments it considers legitimate, and decisions by countries caught between the two powers about which alignment offers more protection. Because the extraction of Maduro did not just remove a president, It removed the assumption that economic influence is enough to protect a government from physical action, and that assumption was central to China's strategy in the global south. Beijing is now operating in a world where that assumption no longer holds, and the adjustments it makes in response will determine whether this moment becomes a turning point or a warning that both powers choose to ignore. But one thing is already clear: China cannot protect governments that align with Beijing if the United States decides to act. And that reality is being felt far beyond Venezuela. Because the next move will not be a statement, it will be a decision that reshapes the balance of power in ways neither Washington nor Beijing can fully predict. And the cost of that decision is still being calculated.